Welcome to The Rubber Meets the Road Economics, the podcast where we explore the driving forces behind today's economy and their real-world implications. Join investor Hunter Craig as he interviews Professor Edwin Burton from the University of Virginia, delving into the complexities of economics with clarity and insight. Whether you're an economics enthusiast or just curious about how economic policies affect your daily life, you're in the right place. Let's get started.
We're here today, February 5th, 2025, world-renowned professor at the University of Virginia, Edwin T. Burton. Welcome, Professor.
Good to see you this afternoon, Hunter.
Professor, what in the world is going on? Last week, the news was 100% talking about DeepSeek. This week, it's all about tariffs. February 1st, last Saturday, the U.S. instituted tariffs on Canada and Mexico, subsequently delayed them for 30 days. What's going on in tariff land?
Well, Hunter, it's an exciting time to be an economics professor for sure. There's an awful lot of things to think about, and many of them are essentially new strategies. Let's start with tariffs. Tariffs have been around for a long time, and the most famous example of avoiding tariffs was Britain in the 19th century. When they repealed the Corn Laws in 1846, that essentially removed the tariff on corn, and that's why they did it. They did it primarily to lower the cost of food so that they could move more people to the cities and not have to pay them too much because the price of agriculture was low. And in fact, agricultural prices fell after that over the next 60 years. So that provided cheap labor because workers didn't have to pay that much for food. Same thing happened in the U.S., by the way, during that same period. From the end of the Civil War to the beginning of the First World War, prices of agricultural goods actually fell over that period. So that was an example of what happens when you don't have tariffs. And so that was always heralded by economists as a good thing. People trade, and that's good. More trade, the better. And in fact, the United States managed to accomplish early on what Europe took many, many years to accomplish, and that is no trade barriers between the different states within the U.S. That was one of its great advantages. When you sold something you produced in Texas and you sold it in Arkansas, you didn't have to go through any tariff walls or any restrictions at all. But that wasn't true if you produced something in Germany and sold it in France, or produced something in Italy and sold it in Austria. You had to frequently go through some kind of a tariff process. So tariffs were a bad word for economists, and to some extent they still are. More trade is certainly good for the group as a whole. The more trade we can do in the U.S. between different states, the better off we are. Where trade poses a problem is that if you have trade between two countries, one has an advantage in the production, relative advantage, it's called comparative advantage in economics, in the production of a good, they will then produce and sell that, export that to the other country. But then the other country who's importing it, their domestic manufacturers could get hurt, whoever handles that. For example, if we import bananas from a South American country, that's going to inhibit banana producers in our own country, and they might, in fact, go out of business. And so that always happens. Trade always has the impact of hurting the country who's importing a particular good. It doesn't hurt the country, but it hurts those folks in that particular business. And we saw that in the U.S. We saw our textile industry in the Southeast disappear. We saw the furniture industry disappear. And large parts of manufacturing in the Midwest kind of went away during the opening of China, which took place initially in 1980, but then accelerated in 1990 and on through into this century. So those industries that got hurt managed to mount a political comeback, and a lot of that's the basis of populism that shows up in the Trump political agenda. Now, an economist would look at that and say, if Detroit is threatened by competition with BYD in China, the right answer is to help those people who are going to lose their jobs. There are 110,000 auto workers in Detroit. And if we're going to have free trade, we can buy these Chinese electric vehicles for $11,000. They're not only good cars, they look pretty nice too. If we do that, the American auto industry, at least that part of it that's in Detroit, will disappear. It will not be able to compete. And I think the correct government response is to help those folks that are hurt in some direct way. Help them financially, help them with retraining either them or their children, build schools in the area, build plants that you might have built somewhere else, build it in Detroit. Take direct action to help those who get hurt by trade. But if you do tariffs, which we did institute some more tariffs against China, for example, 10% tariff, we're all going to pay a price for that. And the people that pay the biggest price will be the relatively poorer people in our country. The people that go to Walmart and are looking for Chinese goods at a cheaper price than what can be made in this country, they'll be hurt. It'll cost them more money to do their regular budget than it would have cost if you didn't have the tariffs. There's no question. Now, some people say, does that mean inflation? Well, it means higher prices. Doesn't necessarily mean inflation. That's the rate at which prices grow over time. It may all happen just immediately within, say, the next 3 or 4 weeks. Prices, for example, of some particular product go up. The iPhone, for example, might get more expensive. Goes from $1,400 iPhone to $1,600 or something like that. So what happens is the gains from trade are typically spread across the whole population, but the losses are concentrated in just a small part of the population. So the right policy is to focus your attention, I think, on the losers and how they're losing and help them. Help Detroit if they're losing. Help the textile industry in the Southeast. Help the city of Danville and some of the cities throughout Southeast America. Remember South Carolina, the old Milliken textile industries that disappeared. Those people needed help, and there were cities that had unemployment rates of 30% or more when they lost their one company in that town, the textile company or the furniture company. So this is a kind of a long-winded way of saying that free trade is actually a good thing, but you have to find some way to compensate the losers. There will always be losers if you have free trade, but free trade is actually better for everyone if you compensate the losers.
Is there a case where you would support any kind of tariffs?
No, I wouldn't. Some argue that you might make a case on national defense grounds, that you don't want to either buy export controls, not letting people buy certain things from you. For example, we have restrictions on NVIDIA's best chips right now. We don't want China to be buying NVIDIA chips. And we might want to put tariffs on some things that we consider adverse to our national security. I guess a country can make those decisions, but the problem with all of that is what is national security and what isn't. Something you might think is national security, I might not think is national security. So you have those issues. But you'll always have an exception for national security. Realistically, that's what governments do. They will have exceptions for national security in their trade policies. They will. You can't stop that. What you can try to stop is the old infant industry argument. In other words, we're going to protect this industry because we want this industry to grow and we want it to be good for our country. That usually is self-defeating because the minute you freeze out competition from other countries, what you do is you grow an industry that's like our current auto industry, one that is never going to be able to compete and will only get weaker. Our auto industry is losing money so fast, it's unbelievable. And we've had massive government handouts to Detroit auto companies. That just long run doesn't work. You end up paying a lot of people a huge amount of money in a losing business. That's what happens when you have a lot of protection and a lot of government help.
What's the effect on the U.S. stock market of tariffs?
The stock market effect will take a while to feel. Let's suppose we go to 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, which we might. The suspension that occurred this week is only for 30 days. In 30 days, we may go back to the 25%. I don't think we will. I think Trump is smart enough to know that a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico would really hurt us. And ironically, it's the one on Mexico that would probably hurt us the worst. People are saying in the press it's the one on Canada because of oil imports, but really it's probably the one on Mexico that hurts us the most. But they both will hurt, and it'll show up in lower GDP. The economy in America will grow much slower. Prices in our country will be significantly higher. Again, I don't think that's an inflation issue. That's a one-time change in the price. Inflation is a continuing change that goes on for a while. I just think it makes us all poorer, and the people at the bottom of the income and wealth distribution are the ones that pay for it. It's not going to hurt Elon Musk, and it's not going to hurt people with a lot of wealth. They'll be fine. But it will hurt people who are paycheck to paycheck.
Professor, the U.S. debt is $36 trillion, heading to $50 trillion in 8 or fewer years. Currently, the U.S. government brings in a little less than $5 trillion. If rates go to 10%, there's no money for anything else other than to pay for the debt. Are we in a debt spiral? And if so, does the Department of Government Efficiency have any effect long-term in that they're just doing something that the market's going to do in the next year or two in any event? And can you reduce spending to have any effect on the overall deficit and debt without addressing healthcare and Social Security?
If you're thinking long term, nothing Doge or Elon Musk is going to do is going to matter very much. From other points of view, what Musk is doing, in my opinion, is a pretty good idea. It's making the government a little bit more responsible to the executive branch, which controls all of that, and a little bit more in keeping with what Congress originally allocated money for. So I think some of the changes that are taking place now by Elon Musk are probably good ones. At one point, 6% was the percentage of federal workers in D.C. that actually showed up for work. Well, if 94% of your workforce is staying at home, I think it's time somebody took a hard look at it. And so Musk and his group are doing it. And of course, there's a lot of hue and cry politically about it all. But that's not going to help you on the debt. That's not why you're doing it. You're trying to make government more efficient, carrying out the wishes of the taxpayers in a more efficient way. I think that's what he's up to, and I think he'll probably succeed in a large measure at doing that. The only way you can make any kind of serious effort about the debt is to reform healthcare. That's the single biggest driver. In the long run, if you can't do that, and it's coupled with the demographics, we're getting to be an older society. We're getting to be an older world. Europe is, we are, Japan is, China. All these large countries, large GDP countries, are aging dramatically, and people are living longer. And that means healthcare costs are going to go up a lot. They're already high, but they're going much higher. If you don't solve the healthcare economics, then you can't solve the debt crisis. Remember, we spend more per capita on healthcare than any country in the world. No one's even close to what we do. We spend an enormous amount, and we don't get a whole lot for it. Our healthcare results are not that impressive globally. So we need a lot of reform in that area. And just all these other items, we could eliminate the defense budget, for example. Suppose we just spent nothing on national defense. Long run, that won't help us. It won't solve the debt problem. And interest rates could come down some, but they're not likely to come down any, given the trajectory of the debt. Our interest problems are going to get worse, more likely than better. The only thing that can rein in interest costs, at least in the short run, is a major recession, but then that leads to a bigger deficit because revenues fall faster than spending. So I come back to the same point. Unless you can wrap your arms around getting costs in healthcare under control, and part of it is our problems in healthcare are getting worse. People are not eating better. The drug situation is out of control. We're not taking care of ourselves like we ought to. And if we're not going to take care of ourselves, then our healthcare costs are going to get a lot worse. I think we need to bring market factors into the healthcare process again. Effectively, we have very, very few people who use healthcare believe that they pay for it. Everybody feels like they walk into a hospital and someone else, either Medicare or Medicaid or your insurance program, whatever it is paying. You're not paying. It's not like when you go in and buy groceries. When you go in and buy groceries, you get out your credit card or your checkbook or whatever, and you pay for it. But when you go into a hospital, that's not how you view it. You might say, well, I've got a copay. I'll pay some small percentage. But people really feel like they don't owe the healthcare system any money when they use it. That's how they feel. And as long as they feel like that, we're going to have a serious problem. Until you get people more cognizant of the real cost of healthcare, which means they have to pay more of it than they're paying, or at least think they pay. Because ultimately, we all pay for it indirectly, but we need to pay for it directly. So I think without tackling healthcare, we're not going to make much progress. I do think, by the way, Social Security is eminently fixable. I think we could fix that in a week.
And what would you do on Social Security?
Well, Social Security, what's kind of interesting about Social Security is it's not what people think. It's not a welfare program at all, because poor people just don't live long enough to get a whole lot of benefit out of it. Warren Buffett is still alive and kicking, and he gets plenty. He gets probably $60,000 a year from healthcare. Whereas if you're his gardener, you probably get $14,000 a year, and you died 10 years ago. So it's very different. Social Security pays the average guy not a whole lot, pays really wealthy people a huge amount. And for people who are likely to die early, it often provides nothing at all. They pay in all their lives, and then they die at the age of 61 or something and never collect a nickel. And unless they have a spouse, that's it. So the answer is, since most of the benefits of Social Security go to high-income people because they're the ones that live the longest, I think most high-income people will say, hey, I don't need this. And I think there's a deal to be made.
Is part of this adding a portability option to Social Security?
Well, what you probably mean by portability is, can I not draw my Social Security benefits, but can I do something else? Can I put it some other way? And what that means, for example, if I'm 30 years old and I'm in the workforce, instead of paying in the full Social Security amount, maybe I pay in some fraction of that, and the other fraction I put in a defined contribution plan so that I manage my own retirement. That works really well. Believe me, if you use your Social Security money and invested it, you do a lot better than waiting to collect Social Security off the same money. So there's a win-win available in Social Security. We can completely fix Social Security and provide better retirements for people. Healthcare is a different story. But Social Security is fixable, interest rates are fixable, defense is fixable, everything's fixable but this one thing, healthcare.
Professor, thank you. You're the best of the best. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for the Rubber Meets the Road Economics podcast. If you enjoyed the discussion, remember to subscribe and stay updated with future episodes. Join us soon for more conversations about modern economics on the Rubber Meets the Road Economics podcast.